He's spent the last 2 years clocking up more air miles than just about anyone else on the planet, so let's hope he has some trade deals to show for it when the UK does finally leave the European Union. I caught up with Dr. Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, just before he left the G20 trade ministers meeting in Argentina, and I started by asking him when the first post-Brexit trade deal will be struck.
Well, of course, the G20 trade ministers isn't about bilateral negotiations, and we can't begin any negotiations on trade agreements until we actually leave the European Union itself in March next year. But I did take the advantage while I was here to have some quiet bilaterals with my opposite numbers from India, from Japan, from Australia, from the United States, and from the European Commission to keep our conversations going. And I'm going from here to Canada. But the main point of the G20 negotiations was to lay the ground for the heads of government leaders who will meet here in Argentina at the end of the year. And we were dealing with some of those big trade issues that are out there at the present time. The trade dispute between China and the United States, which is having wider ramifications, and of course the issue of the WTO itself and whether we now need substantial reform, and if so, how we get it. So it was a fairly busy agenda.
It's interesting that you are talking about some of the meetings you've been having with your counterparts from places like India. It feels to me as if one thing that we haven't been talking about perhaps as much as we should during these kind of Brexit discussions is immigration. Immigration likely to be a very big part of any trade deals that you strike with countries such as India, China, Argentina. They will be likely to be demanding some kind of relaxation of visa requirements. So do you think it's time for the government to drop its target to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands?
No, because we're going to have a real sea change in our ability to control migration with the end of free movement. And of course, it's been quite an issue with countries that you very correctly mentioned, like India, that we give free movement for EU citizens coming in when companies that invest in the UK may want to bring some of their own people with them. And I think that we need to look on this issue at what we know the British people think. And from attitudinal surveys, we know that the British people think that if you come to Britain and you've got a job and you pay your taxes and contribute to the wealth of the country, that's welcome. But what hasn't been welcome is people who are able to come to the United Kingdom on spec and be able to use our public services like education and housing and health without ever having contributed anything to the country. And I think that is what lay behind the strong public movement against the concept of the free movement of people in the European Union. Now, as we end that, it means that within the targets that we've set for migration, we're able to set a more level playing field, if you like, for the talent that may come from overseas. So a lot of countries see our exit from the European Union as a real bonus from that point of view, in that it does create a more level playing field for them.
So they see it as a bonus, presumably, because they think that there will be more immigration access for some of their citizens. Could we be seeing an increase in migration from non-EU countries after Brexit?
Well, what they think is that within the limits that we have set as a country, that they will have a better chance of being able to get access to some of those places. So it's not about more migration, but it's about not having the migration picture skewed towards EU citizens, whether or not they have the talents that employers are looking for. So again, global employers and those investors in the United Kingdom, which have made the UK the world's third top destination for inward investment and the top in Europe, can see the benefits that the ending of free movement might bring to them and to the UK economy.
One thing that is kind of puzzling me a little bit about the debate on immigration is that we effectively haven't heard much about what the government sees as its post-Brexit immigration policy, particularly, of course, considering for many people it was their #1 reason for voting to leave the EU. So I'm interested to know, for you, is it a red line that the preferential sort of status, if you like, of EU citizens is ended?
Well, we have to end free movement. We have to end free movement to honour the result of the referendum. We voted to have control of our borders, we voted to have control of our laws, and voted to have control of our money. And so we need to see that free movement is brought to an end. I think it's, from the points I've been making to, it's very clear that it has its advantages, not just in terms of stopping public services being used by those who haven't contributed, but can be an extra tool in the box when it comes to future trade negotiations with other countries.
So it's something that you're planning on using then, offering kind of relaxation of visa requirements in return for a good trade deal?
Well, one of the things that companies that invest in the United Kingdom do, as British companies that invest overseas do, is to say we want the freedom of what's known as intra-company transfers, the ability to have their own people running their own businesses. Where we're able to offer that more because we're able to control our immigration by not having free movement, again, that's an extra tool that we will have. And that's welcomed by the global investors that I've spoken to, from the United States to the Far East and everything in between.
OK. Now, last month you said that there was a 60% chance of a no-deal outcome. So do you think that a no-deal Brexit outcome is more likely or less likely now?
I think over the last few weeks we've certainly heard more reassuring noises from the European Commission and some of our European partners, and I think as they've understood that Britain is serious, that if we don't get a good deal we could end up with no deal. I think that they've taken the economic view that we have to get a liberal and open agreement on trade with Britain more seriously, and I think that the dial has moved in that direction. Impossible to say how much, because we need to get agreement of all our European partners, but from the ones that I've been talking to and some of my colleagues, we've certainly seen a more positive view about the need to get that economic agreement. And as I've often said, I've even said on this programme before, we have a real choice to make, both Britain and the rest of the European Union, about whether this is a Brexit that's about the bureaucrats and political ideology on one hand, or if it's actually about the prosperity and the jobs and the well-being of the people of Europe on the other. And I very much hope it's the latter.
If it is about the prosperity and the well-being of the people in Europe and the UK as well, then some people have suggested that in order to prevent a no-deal outcome, we should effectively extend Article 50 and delay Brexit. What would you say to those people who argue that?
I'd say no. As I've said before, extending Article 50 until we've got an agreement is effectively allowing the European Union to dictate when Britain will leave the European Union itself. The public have given us an instruction in the referendum. There has to be a time set for our exit. That's the 29th of March next year, and we should honour that.
Now, it feels to me that if you were one of a shrinking pool, if you like, of Brexiteers that the Prime Minister can rely on to go out there and defend her Chequers plan, do you sometimes look at the game that other people are playing in your party and some of the comments that they've been making, people who voted leave like yourself, Boris Johnson perhaps, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and think that actually they're playing a bit of a dangerous game by trashing Chequers in public?
Well, I don't think it's a game at all, because the stakes are so high for the United Kingdom and for Europe and beyond. And one of the things that I've been picking up here in Argentina from other G20 ministers is that if there are new impediments to trade and investment as a result of any EU agreement with Britain, then there are lots of other places for international investors to put their money rather than Europe. But I think that if you look at the issue in the round, do we want an agreement or do we not want an agreement? Yes, in my view, we should get an agreement. Do we want one that maintains an open and liberal trading relationship with the European Union, which, although it might be a shrinking proportion of our total trade, is still not, nonetheless, about 43% of our exports? Of course we want to do that. We want to access that European market in a way that will encourage British businesses to trade with Europe and encourage European businesses to trade with Britain, while at the same time not tying our hands for some of those big global opportunities that are out there in the future. That involves an element of compromise. And what the government has put to the European Union in terms of the Chequers offer, and let's remember, it's still only an offer, nothing has been agreed yet, is a reasonable way to maintain that European trade without tying our hands too much. Now, we're awaiting, as you know, a full response from the European Union to our ideas, and we think it's, as I say, a reasonable, constructive way forward. If they don't like those ideas, then they will need to come back to Britain and say what they think is a way to maintain all those elements of trade, and also to not see any divisions between the United Kingdom that would make, for example, a border down the Irish Sea, making Northern Ireland different from any other part of the UK. A number of different considerations But I do detect that there is a movement from the European Union towards getting a deal. It's by no means certain, but I think that it's moving in the right direction, although no deal remains a possibility for which we have to prepare.
It's interesting to hear you say that Chequers is a reasonable offer. I mean, after 2 years of trying for the government to come up with something, surely you would have hoped that they'd come up with something that you'd be able to really sell to people rather than just saying that it's a reasonable offer. There's lots of chatter around the future of Theresa May, Conservative MPs openly discussing whether or not she's going to have to go after sealing the deal on Brexit. Do you think that Theresa May will lead the Conservative Party into the next election?
You know, I've been in Parliament for 26 years. I can't remember very many times when there wasn't chatter about who was going to take over the leadership of the Conservative Party. So I tend to aim off a little bit, if you'll excuse me for that. I think the Prime Minister is doing a great job in difficult circumstances, both domestically because of the lack of majority in the House of Commons and in the difficult task of this negotiation with the European Union. And I think that supporting the Prime Minister now is in our national interests. And certainly if she wants to continue on to the next election, she will have my support. And I think a British Prime Minister that delivers a successful Brexit will have the support of the British public.
Liam Fox there, live from Argentina, being very supportive of Theresa May.